She entered the interview composed, competent, and excessively prepared. Yet they regarded her as if she were an outsider. What remained unknown to them was that her spouse had recently acquired the business, and he was observing everything unfold. Renee Carson understood how to present herself professionally. At 43 years old, with an established background in strategic marketing, and greater professional composure than most executives earning double her income, she rarely questioned her own judgment. However, that particular morning, as she positioned her grey Acura in the underground parking facility of a modern glass-fronted building in central Austin, her fingers lingered on the steering wheel momentarily longer than usual. She gazed forward intently, inhaled one deep breath, then collected her leather portfolio, adjusted her navy blazer, and proceeded into the elevator. Her heels resonated with self-assurance. Her curriculum vitae was flawless, her recommendations impressive. This meeting at Bradford Keenan & Associates wasn't merely a job prospect. It represented her opportunity to reconstruct her career after withdrawing from the workforce for nearly 24 months to tend to her father. Renee was prepared to rejoin the professional arena, and she wasn't planning to enter halfway. The reception area was elegant yet impersonal. Stark white walls, intense lighting, contemporary artwork that conveyed very little meaning. At the reception counter sat a youthful woman, with a powdered complexion, shiny ponytail, and a gaze that scrutinized Renee's figure as though she didn't deserve to be there. "Good morning," Renee offered with a smile. "I'm here for the 10 o'clock appointment with Elaine Beckman." The receptionist blinked, seemingly surprised by her friendliness. She pressed something on her keyboard and glanced at her monitor. "You're Renee Carson?" she asked, followed by a pause, and then a subtle before lifting the desk telephone. Her tone dropped to something hushed, while her eyes remained fixed on Renee. Following a brief conversation, she returned the handset and forced a smile that appeared insincere. "Someone will escort you shortly," she stated. Renee expressed gratitude and settled on a grey bench near the glass partition. She checked her timepiece, 9:52, punctual as always. She surveyed her surroundings. No other individuals waiting, no bustling staff or movement of candidates, merely silence and chilled air. 5 minutes elapsed, then 10. At 7 minutes past 10, a tall gentleman in a charcoal suit emerged from a frosted glass corridor. He didn't acknowledge her immediately. When he finally did, his expression registered polite astonishment, as if anticipating someone else. "Renee Carson," she confirmed, rising to her feet. "I'm Devon Marks, Marketing Director. I'll be joining Elaine today." He neglected to extend his hand, simply pivoted, and indicated the direction down the hallway. She trailed behind him. No casual conversation, no inquiry about her journey, just the rubbery squeak of his footwear on the polished tiles. In the conference room, Elaine Beckman was seated with an open laptop, spectacles positioned low on her nose. She remained seated. "Let's commence," she announced. The inquiries came rapidly, but not the variety Renee expected. "Are you certain this is the position you submitted for? How knowledgeable are you regarding client-interfacing technology? Have you worked in a corporate environment of this magnitude previously? Why the 2-year employment gap?" Something underlay each question, something off-putting. The demeanor wasn't investigative, it was skeptical, bordering on sarcastic. At one juncture, Elaine arched an eyebrow when Renee described managing international accounts. International, from which locations specifically? Singapore, Toronto, Frankfurt. After 15 minutes, Devon closed his notebook. "Actually, it appears there's been a miscommunication. This role was filled internally yesterday," he stated. "Apologies for the inconvenience." Before she could respond, Elaine added, "We'll maintain your application in our database." They stood, offered no handshake, no escort, just a subtle gesture toward the exit. Renee traversed back to the reception area. The receptionist was engaged on her telephone, pretending not to notice her. The elevator doors parted. She entered alone. Nobody thanked her for attending, but before she even reached the parking facility, someone upstairs had witnessed everything. On the 10th level of that identical building, behind a barrier of tinted glass, Julian Maris stood completely motionless. He hadn't shifted position since the receptionist answered the phone. From his vantage point, he'd observed how her eyes narrowed. He witnessed how Devon adjusted his necktie upon spotting Renee. Julian had monitored the entire scenario in silence, hands clasped behind his back, jaw clenched. every word of the discussion filtering through the live audio transmission in the observation suite. 3 days earlier, Julian had completed the majority acquisition of Bradford Keene and Associates, discreet, deliberate, and not yet public knowledge. He avoided press announcements. That wasn't his approach. Julian was 47, well-groomed, composed in the manner a man must be when everyone in proximity desires his signature. Born in Lubbock, educated in San Diego, he established his reputation by transforming medium-sized tech consultancies into multi-million-dollar enterprises. And when he observed the financial data behind Bradford Keene, alongside its glaring absence of diversity in management, he didn't hesitate. But this wasn't simply another transaction. This was a litmus test. He wanted to evaluate who he was inheriting. No scripts, no rehearsed welcomes. He didn't inform anyone of Renee's identity. She had volunteered to skip the entire process, but he requested she attend just to observe what would transpire. And now he possessed his answer. "Replay the final 2 minutes," Julian instructed. Beside him, a junior legal analyst manipulated several keys, and the dialogue repeated through a discreet speaker. Elaine's tone, Devon's indifference, the way they interrupted Renee. And that phrase, "We'll maintain your application in our database." He remained silent, momentarily, then turned toward the control panel on the wall and pressed a button. "I want HR in my office at 11:30, he declared, his voice expressionless. The assistant on the receiving end paused. "Which HR manager, sir?" "All of them." A pause. "Yes, sir." Julian gazed across the metropolitan landscape. Austin glistened in the late morning sunlight. A small aircraft drifted past in the distance. Below, individuals continued with their daily routines, unaware that a very different meeting was about to commence upstairs. Down the corridor, 2 former board members were positioned in a transition room. They had no inkling that a reorganization of executives was already in progress. Julian had devoted his initial 48 hours to examining everything: memos, internal chat logs, interview notes, hiring statistics. There existed a pattern, and not a subtle one. Across 6 years, nearly all middle-level and senior appointments looked identical on documentation: same universities, same postal codes, same social circles, different names, same template. Julian rarely discussed his background, but he'd encountered enough of this behavior when he began his career. The attitude, the dismissal, the backhanded skepticism. They labeled it cultural compatibility. He termed it comfort bias. He paced once, halted, and turned to his analyst. "Do we have the camera angle from the reception desk?" "Yes. I want a complete record of this interaction, audio and visual. I want it time-stamped and documented. I'll have it delivered to your office within 20 minutes. Julian nodded. "Thank you, Leanne." Then, without another utterance, he departed. Back in the elevator, he leaned against the wall and briefly closed his eyes. He wasn't furious in the conventional sense. It was more akin to confirmation, a puzzle fragment, falling precisely where he anticipated. He messaged Renee, "Heading home soon. Don't depart just yet." She didn't reply immediately. She likely required a moment. He comprehended that. But before he reached the lobby, Julian already recognized one certainty. If these individuals believed they could evaluate her with a checklist and a smirk, they were about to discover what occurs when the positions are reversed. But upstairs, time was ticking, and not everyone would anticipate the impending reset. Renee walked toward the parking garage, as if she carried bricks in her footwear. It wasn't rage that burdened her, not precisely. It was something weightier. She maintained her head upright, but each footstep echoed more loudly in her thoughts than it did on the glossy floor. The elevator doors shut behind her, and that frigid, regulated environment faded. By the time she reached her vehicle, the early confidence from that morning seemed like an eternity ago. She opened the driver's door, slid inside and closed it. She didn't activate the engine, didn't check her mobile device, just sat there. The daylight streamed through the concrete slats, casting striped patterns across the dashboard. Her hands rested in her lap. She wasn't tearful, but her throat felt constricted. She glimpsed her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her lipstick remained impeccable, hair still sleek, her blazer crisp, and yet somehow she felt imperceptible. 15 years in marketing, 5 major campaigns, 2 Fortune 500 corporations on her resume, and never, not once, Had she ever been asked if she was certain she applied for the correct position? She exhaled gradually. Renee had been away from the industry for a period, yes, but not disconnected. When her father's condition deteriorated in 2021, she abandoned everything without hesitation. She coordinated his medications, appointments, meals, and emotional states with the same efficiency she once applied to quarterly performance assessments. And after his passing last winter, she took 6 months to recuperate, to breathe, to rediscover her identity. Then one evening, she looked across the dinner table at Julian and declared, "I'm prepared." He didn't inquire what she meant. He simply reached for her hand and replied, "Then pursue what belongs to you." So she did. Renee invested the subsequent 3 weeks revising her resume, researching firms, updating her portfolio, and practicing mock interviews with colleagues from her previous team. She studied industry reports until late hours, created a list of companies with robust upward momentum, and began scheduling interviews. Bradford Keene topped her list, and they hadn't even truly considered her. She reflected on Julian's words from the previous evening. "I recognize your value. You recognize your value. The room either perceives it, or they reveal themselves. Either outcome benefits us." She had smiled then, assuming he was merely attempting to alleviate her anxiety. She hadn't realized how earnest he was. Her phone vibrated. A text from him. "Heading home soon. Don't depart just yet." No punctuation, which indicated he was concentrated. She recognized that tone even in a message. She contemplated phoning him, contemplated sending a half-amused, half-frustrated message. "You were correct." But she refrained. Something suggested this wasn't concluded yet. Something suggested Julian wasn't merely observing. He was strategizing. She retrieved her notebook from the passenger seat and opened it. On the inside cover, inscribed in her own handwriting, were 4 words, "Your presence is power." She closed the book and remained motionless for another moment. Then she activated the engine, reversed slowly, and merged smoothly into the light. No anger in her expression, no panic in her breathing, just calmness. The kind you observe just before the sky transforms its hue. But while Renee was collecting her thoughts, others were hurrying to revise theirs. Devon Marks was midway through consuming his tuna sandwich when his phone illuminated with a notification from internal communications. Mandatory HR meeting, 11:30 precisely. 10th floor boardroom. Attendance mandatory. He blinked, verified the sender, then the time. "Elaine," he called from his office, mouth still full. "Did you receive that invitation?" Down the corridor, Elaine Beckman was adjusting her blouse in the window reflection. She didn't rotate. "Yeah. Arrived 10 minutes ago. Any insight regarding its purpose?" "No idea," she responded, still smoothing the crease in her collar. "Probably something related to the merger documentation." Devon shrugged and returned to his workstation. He didn't give it much consideration. Just another day in the corporate shuffle. HR meetings materialized regularly, typically concerning compliance updates or employee surveys. No one examined. But throughout the building, a vastly different conversation was occurring behind a secured door. Julian stood in the corner of the boardroom, arms crossed, expression unreadable. To his left was Leanne, the junior analyst. Beside her, 2 HR directors, Rosa Levington and Martin Cross, both of whom appeared as if they were entering an ambush they hadn't trained for. "Are they informed?" Julian inquired softly. "They believe it's procedural," Leanne answered. He nodded once. "Good." At 28 minutes past 11, Devon arrived. Elaine followed at 29 minutes past 11. They entered laughing about a client misprint, until they noticed the arrangement. No projector, no agenda, no paperwork, just Julian. He didn't speak initially. Let the silence hang in the atmosphere like vapor off pavement. Elaine cleared her throat. "Sorry, we weren't informed about you're going to be Julian," he stated. He glanced toward Rosa and gestured for her to continue. Rosa retrieved a folder and extracted a bundle of transcripts. "These are selections," she began. "From today's morning interview session with one of our external applicants," she continued. "Specifically, the 10 o'clock appointment with Miss Renee Carson." Devon's eyes widened in surprise. "Wait, what?" Elaine narrowed her eyes. "I thought that appointment was cancelled." "It wasn't," Rosa replied. Martin, who had mostly remained quiet until now, finally contributed. "The interview was documented, recorded and monitored remotely. This follows our new protocol under the company's equity review policy. Elaine repositioned herself uncomfortably in her chair. Are we being charged with something? Rosa maintained her even tone. You're being offered an opportunity to explain the interaction. Julian eventually stepped forward. You both had the chance to evaluate a candidate who fulfilled every requirement listed in your job posting. In fact, she surpassed several of them. But instead of conducting a proper interview, you asked if she had applied to the right position, and then informed her the role had already been taken. Devon sat speechless, his jaw moving without sound. He struggled to formulate a response. We had a late internal candidate submit an application, he began. After the 10 o'clock slot had already commenced, Julian inquired. Elaine shifted position again. With all due respect, this candidate didn't appear to be suitable. Her professional history seemed somewhat disjointed. There was a 2-year employment gap, to tend to a terminally ill parent. Julian interrupted. Which was explicitly mentioned on her resume. Neither of them uttered a word. He gazed at them intently. What else did you overlook? Or more accurately, what did you notice that made you decide she wasn't deserving of the complete 30 minutes? Elaine parted her lips to speak, then closed them, and lowered her gaze. Julian gave a slight nod. That's exactly what I suspected. Yvonne's face was growing crimson. Listen, we meant no harm. It was a misinterpretation. Happens occasionally. Julian's voice remained composed. Happens to whom? Silence filled the room. Here's what will occur, he said, stepping backward. A comprehensive review of your department's hiring practices is currently underway. Every candidate you've rejected, every person you've employed, we're examining it all. And when the press announcement is distributed next week about the leadership transition, your names will be absent from it. Elaine abruptly raised her head. Wait, this isn't personal, Julian stated, maintaining eye contact with her. It's systemic. And while the boardroom was engulfed in quietness, one woman was already returning through those front entrances. Renee's heels made a measured rhythmic sound across the lobby floor. This occasion, no receptionist greeted her with a look. No hushed murmurs, no sidelong glances. Instead, a tall individual in a grey business suit approached, as soon as the elevator doors parted. Miss Carson, he asked, respectful and composed. Yes, please follow me. Mr. Morris is expecting you. She accompanied him through a private corridor she hadn't previously noticed. It was decorated with framed accolades and testimonials from clients. The atmosphere here felt distinctive, cooler, yet not the sterile chill of the main lobby. Something else, anticipation, or perhaps simply respect. They halted outside a meeting room with wall-to-wall windows overlooking the urban skyline. The door swung open, and Julian rose to welcome her. His expression was gentle, his eyes searching hers for an indication. Was she all right? Had the flame scorched her, or merely ignited a fuse? She offered a slight nod, no smile, but she was prepared. He turned toward the others seated around the table, 3 senior executives, a legal representative, and Rosa from HR. Everyone, Julian commenced. I'd like to introduce Renee Carson, strategic marketing leader, with over 15 years of measurable high-impact achievements, and until 2 hours ago, someone your hiring team determined wasn't qualified for the position she helped define. Renee didn't recoil. She moved forward, and spoke with clarity. I want to clarify several points, she said. I wasn't seeking charity when I submitted my application. I wasn't hoping someone would recognize my potential. I understand what I contribute to the discussion. I don't require validation from others. A moment of silence followed. Rosa acknowledged her with a gentle nod. One executive made a notation. I took time away from my career, because my father was dying, Renee continued. And I make no apologies for that decision. What I refuse to accept is being diminished to a bullet point that's discarded without consideration. Julian retreated, and allowed her to command the room. Renee partially turned toward the legal representative. I recognize that organizations face pressure to present themselves as inclusive, but here's the reality. Genuine inclusivity cannot be manufactured. It's evident in situations like this, in how individuals are treated when they enter your premises, not merely when cameras are recording or press statements are released. The room remained attentive and silent. One executive, a woman named Carla Baines, leaned forward. Miss Carson, I offer no excuse for this morning's events, nor do I intend to provide one. But I want to ask honestly, if given the opportunity to lead here, would you still desire it? Renee paused, not because she was uncertain of her answer, but because the moment deserved thoughtful consideration. Then simply, I arrived here this morning, seeking an opportunity. What I received instead was clarity. I refuse to work somewhere that hesitates to recognize my worth. I'm not a possibility. I'm not someone to gamble on. I'm a proven investment. Julian's mouth twitched slightly, almost forming a smile, but not quite. Carla settled back, visibly impressed. Renee turned to Julian. Are we finished? He nodded once. Always. As Renee exited the room, she didn't glance behind her. The hallway outside felt different now, not because it had transformed, but because she had changed. But while Renee departed with greater strength, the company was left struggling to rebuild what she had exposed. The following day, Bradford Keene's internal messaging system erupted like an emergency alarm. Subject line: leadership update and organizational change. Employees clicked curiously, half expecting the usual corporate rhetoric. What they received instead was a reality check. The company's new CEO, Julian Maris, formally introduced himself, not merely as the latest in a succession of executives, but as an engaged owner with a distinctly clear agenda. He didn't squander time with ambiguous promises. He enumerated names, dates, changes. Effective immediately, the hiring division would undergo a thorough audit. An external consulting group would manage recruitment until the evaluation was complete. 2 senior department heads, Devon Marks and Elaine Beckman, were no longer employed by the company. Rumors began circulating quickly. What occurred? Why them? Was there an issue with the merger? By midday, the HR department felt completely transformed. Closed office doors, subdued conversations, a kind of tension hanging in the air without requiring explanation. Julian maintained an open-door policy. He had no interest in concealment. He'd reached a decision, and now it was about implementation. The company had invested years building a reputation for innovation, yet nobody seemed to notice that the individuals making decisions all shared similar appearances. That would change now. Around 3 p.m., Carla Baines entered Julian's office. She declined our offer, she stated directly. Julian looked up. Good. Carla raised an eyebrow questioningly. She merits better than a hastily arranged PR opportunity, he explained. Let her compose her own next chapter. We simply provided the material. Carla nodded, still adding, would have been beneficial to have her on our team. She's not gone, Julian remarked. She's just not here. Across town, Renee was sitting in a peaceful cafe with her laptop open. She was reviewing a draft proposal. 2 days earlier, she had decided she wouldn't return after the second interview, if you could label it as such. She departed that glass building feeling lighter than she had in months. Julian hadn't urged her to accept the position. He hadn't pressured her to remain involved. He simply asked what she desired, and what she wanted was now hers. Her own company, her own principles, her own table, not waiting for an invitation to someone else's. She had already secured several clients from her previous network, people who had discreetly reached out during the past year, asking if she was prepared to consult. She hadn't affirmed back then, but now she was more than ready. The business would concentrate on brand storytelling and consumer strategy, with a clear mission to elevate underrepresented voices throughout the process. She would name it True North Strategies. Julian had smiled at the name choice. The barista placed a coffee cup on the table beside her. Here you are, Miss Carson, she said. It's complimentary. Renee looked up, surprised. Pardon. The barista smiled shyly. My aunt told me about yesterday's incident. Said you handled it professionally. Renee didn't immediately respond, just smiled, accepted the cup, and nodded once. Beyond the window, the sky was beginning to turn golden. But while Renee commenced building something new, those who had underestimated her were still occupied trying to explain their mistakes. That evening, Renee stood at the kitchen counter, cutting lemons for a pot of tea. The house was fragrant with rosemary and sage, remnants from the roast Julian had prepared earlier. She heard ice cubes clinking in a glass behind her, as he entered and positioned himself against the refrigerator. You know, he said, when I suggested you attend that interview, I wasn't testing your abilities. I know, she answered, continuing to slice. You were evaluating them. Julian laughed softly. I didn't anticipate they would fail so dramatically, especially with recording devices operating. That's because you still extend people the benefit of doubt. Renee carried the lemon slices to the stove and gently dropped them into the simmering pot. The tea emitted a hiss as the citrus contacted the surface. They perceived what they wished to see, she said. That's consistently been the issue. People glance right over you and believe they're doing you a favor with their hasty judgments. Julian approached and placed his hand on her back. You remained composed though, even in that boardroom. I've never witnessed you being so still. She smiled faintly without looking up. Being still doesn't equate to being silent. They remained there for several moments, quiet yet filled with unspoken understanding. Then Julian inquired. They extended the offer, didn't they? The position. Renee switched off the stove. They did. And I informed them I had secured a superior opportunity.
Julian raised his eyebrows questioningly.
Have you chosen a name yet?
True North Strategies.
He nodded thoughtfully. Powerful, clean, authentically yours. She poured tea into 2 mugs and handed him one. Do you believe it will make a difference? She suddenly asked. One woman walking away, one small firm beginning. Julian took a sip before responding. It holds more significance than any headline. Most of the transformation we require doesn't originate in press announcements. It begins in spaces like that one. It starts when someone maintains composure and doesn't excuse people's behavior just because they're uncomfortable. She didn't immediately answer, just stood observing steam rising from her cup. Have you ever considered, she asked after a pause, that the same individuals who instruct us to be patient are those hoping we'll remain quiet? Julian regarded her without uttering a word, because he understood she wasn't requesting one. The doorbell chimed, soft and unexpected. Renee walked to the entrance and opened it. Carla stood there holding a plain envelope. I preferred not to send this electronically, she said. It's a formal acknowledgement of how matters were handled. It includes an apologetic letter and a separate statement signed by the board. Renee didn't accept the envelope. Carla cleared her throat. I realize this doesn't remedy anything, but we wanted you to know we recognized it all, every aspect of it. Renee met her gaze directly. That's a beginning, she said quietly. But remember, respect isn't delivered in a folder. Carla nodded. Understood. She turned to depart, but before descending from the porch, she paused. For whatever it's worth, Carla added, they're frightened now, not of you but of being observed. Renee gave a small, barely perceptible nod, then closed the door. Back in the kitchen, Julian was seated at the table scanning through his phone. Anything noteworthy? She asked. Actually, yes. Someone from Sandwell Partners messaged me inquiring about you. Mentioned they heard you're active in the industry again. Renee grinned. Tell them I don't participate in games anymore, only results. He laughed. I'll communicate that message. They sat together in the kitchen, the silence no longer oppressive, just complete, filled with clarity, filled with choice. This wasn't about retribution. It never had been. It concerned truth, about being acknowledged and choosing not to diminish yourself, even when others attempted to confine you. Renee didn't yell, didn't post online, didn't beg. She exited, then constructed her own entrance. If this narrative evoked emotion in you, share it, because somewhere, someone is currently being overlooked, and they deserve recognition. Subscribe for additional stories that unveil what lies beneath the surface and remind us what genuine strength resembles.